In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, grant us concentration, that we may learn, listen, understand, have a peaceful mind, and remember that you're with us always. Amen. So in this video, we're going to continue to talk about biodiversity. Again, looking at this and beginning to think about conservation biology and what we know about an ecosystem can tell us a lot about how we're going to conserve that ecosystem and some of the implications that are there. So when we talk about biodiversity, and we've already brought this up when we connected this to the net primary productivity of a given area, and we've also talked about this in relationship to the climate of a particular area. Now we're going to talk about what do we actually mean by biodiversity. And so we're talking about the number of species in a given area. When we talk about this, there's a couple of things that we can say about this. And so richness is an example of biodiversity at its best. And so richness is not only the number of different species, okay? So not only the number of species, but also the relationships between the species present, okay? And so this relationship is important, okay? Because it's going to be able to show how different species can support or connect with each other to allow the other species to connect. And again, thinking back to some of the community ecology examples that we did with the symbiosis and the symbiotic relationships, that's really what it comes down to, is establishing them. And so the number of species or the diversity of species that are present there can vary based on the range of adaptation, how the organism is able to adapt to changes. So can it move out? Can it increase its fundamental niche as it adapts over time, how it changes? How are the behavioral? So think about back to the anoles we talked about when we talked about resource partitioning. The evolution of that particular species into the different species increased the behavior because of the color, what types, what locations that they were feeding on. This may also have impacts ecologically, speaking about how the relationships establish, but also how the different characteristics or the different parts of the abiotic system are affected by introducing or removing species from that. And finally, physiological. Okay, some of the connections that we make here are going to then change how the relationship is there. So what is the value, or the direct value, if you will, of biodiversity? Well, one example of this is found in monoculture. So monoculture is this idea of farming in which we grow very large amounts of one plant, or one type of plant, one cultivar of wheat, or maybe I should be picking corn because we have corn in the pictures here. These are also varieties of rice, so we could use that too. And so with domestic crops, or crops that we raise for human consumption, a lot of times biodiversity becomes an issue because we're raising one crop that grows with the maximum potential for producing the most amount of grain. Okay. And that's really important, obviously, for increased production. However, this comes with a limitation. Okay. So if we end up growing one crop for a very long time, we remove genes from that particular crop that may assist it. Maybe it's resistance to a fungus, or resistance to a bacterial infection, or even a viral infection that may affect the crop. So if we're growing one crop over and over that's been bred just for productivity, okay, we're going to end up removing genes that may be important to maintain that. And so if we lose the biodiversity in these crops, we end up with a situation where one infection can wipe out the whole crop, which leads to food insecurity or bioinsecurity. In natural systems, we can say the same thing, but we see this more in agricultural. So there's been a very big push to maintain the wild relatives. Some of the corn relatives that don't produce as large cobs, as many cobs, are important because they may increase pest resistance. They may have genes in there that are resistant to a particular strain of fungus or bacteria, which would prevent it from being lost. And so there's been a very big movement recently among agricultural interests to preserve these wild crops to potentially breed in the genes that are missing. Okay. Another example of biodiversity is shown in medicinal plants. Okay. And so we talked about the secondary chemicals that the plants make, or secondary metabolites that plants make, as a form of protection. And as we begin to look closer at these chemicals, we see a lot of the side effects that are important. 62% of all cancer drugs are developed from these. We talked about Taxol as an example, periwinkle as an example. There's a lot of more examples. By removing biodiversity, we remove the possibility of identifying additional chemicals or potential targets that are present there. So that's the direct value of biodiversity. What do we see for indirect values? Well, indirect values are a little more difficult to quantify, but we can see this over a long range of time. Water quality is an example. The variety of different plants that grow in a certain area, different plants are able to absorb and remove different chemicals that may be present there. Okay? This would be, this idea of phytoremediation, where we plant certain plants because they'll absorb minerals, metals that are present there and capture them to help purify the water. They'll also remove, because they're sort of solid, or the roots will be able to remove some of the other toxins that are present there. They buffer the ecosystem, okay? So if we have a larger variety of plants there, that means that storms or high times where there's a lot of water, which might kill some, won't kill all the plants. Same as droughts. When there's not water present there for a long period of time, having diverse different plants there be able to provide for that. Loss of nutrients. Okay, we talked about that with the Hubbard Brook Farm, where they were looking at deforestation and the removal of nitrogen. As long as the plants remain there, and again, the more diversity of plants, the better possibility of creating, and related to this is recycling, that it's able, more plants, more to uptake, more removal, more movement of the nutrient cycle at different levels. They also can act to affect the climate. Okay? Think about transpiration. Okay, and the value that transpiration has as far as providing moisture to the atmosphere. We can see this with other nutrients that are present there too. Now when I talk about productivity, this is getting back to this idea somewhat related to productivity in an agricultural sense and being able to maintain crops, but the same idea is present in the wild. That the larger variety of, even if it's the same plant that's there or similar plants that's there, that means there's going to be difference in their resistance to different conditions, which can create a more stable ecosystem and allow for that to occur. An example of this was shown in the mangroves and the shrimp farms, where we have these mangroves that are growing near the shrimp farms that are able to be supported and remove some of the waste that the shrimp farmers are producing, or the shrimp are producing, to be able to maintain a more stable ecosystem. So that gives you an example of that. Now, a specific example was shown in the New York City water supply. Okay? And so in the 1990s, there was a movement to dramatically improve the quality of water that the people of New York were being given. And so they required cleaner water qualities and, increased removal of pollutants from there. Well, there was a study done as they were beginning to look at this, and they said, okay, well, one way we can do this, sort of, if you will, the industrial way to do this, was to build better water treatment plants and to use the chemical means or the processing means in these plants to improve water quality. And so they estimated to build a new plant, or the plants to get the quality, would require $6 billion. Now, most of the water from New York, as you can see in this picture here, comes from the Catskill wetlands or watershed in upstate New York, and it's moved down into New York to be able to provide water for the city. And what they found was if they could improve water quality by conserving, by improving the ecosystem around the sources of water, which would cost only 1/6, still $1 billion, is nothing to really feel like it's nothing, but it's considerably less than the amount that it would have taken to build the plant. So the conservation or the biodiversity being maintained around the water sources allowed them to reduce the cost for improving the water. And again, we've kind of already started to talk about this, but all of this is leading us to, if we understand the ecosystem, if we understand the regulation of biodiversity, it gives us a chance to then think about how we can conserve, how we can maintain, how we can keep the ecosystems in balance. And this is really the goal of conservation biology. So when we talk about conservation biology, and I give you a reasonable definition here, conservation biology seeks to understand how to preserve species, communities, and the ecosystems. Again, communities in this case, we're talking about natural communities, populations of related species. And it's always a striking thing when we think about over time the process of extinction, natural process that has occurred over the millions of years of Earth, that more than 99% of the known species have gone extinct. And we can use these extinctions as a lesson, okay, as a way to begin to understand how we can avoid this in the future. So conservation biology will study what are the causes of extinction. Again, not always going to be human impact, although human impact does have a lot to do with that, as we mentioned with the DDT example, the acid rain example, but also means by which we can then prevent it. How can we work with the ecosystems to be able to not only preserve species that are present there, but to be able to begin to restore threatened species. And this all starts with understanding what is present and what is going on in the system. Okay? So what are some of the factors responsible for extinction? Well, one of the really bad examples, human impact, is overexploitation. Okay? This is a historical cause, and we have many examples. Bison in the American West, passenger pigeon, really thousands of them. We're seeing some impact with cod fishing. I always like to throw in swordfish in here too, and we'll talk about the swordfish in a little bit. And then whaling for the blubber, for the fat, before we discovered petroleum. Whaling was a very important source of oil and fat that was used for multiple uses. And so historically we see over time that overfishing, overhunting, overcollection of these species have led to either endangerment or extinction. So by putting in factors regulating the fishing, the collection of that. So I'll use the example of the swordfish, not on this slide, but is a good example, I think, of awareness. And so swordfish is a very good fish, tastes very good, has a nice solid texture. But one of the issues that we have with the collection of swordfish is many swordfish that are used for human consumption are collected before they're sexually mature, which means they're not being given time to be able to produce offspring that will replace the fish that are being removed. So awareness of that has allowed us to then look into other species to use that would be able to replace over time. Another cause of extinction is habitat loss, okay? And so we have a couple of examples here that we're going to talk about as far as the habitat loss. The first one is simply destruction. Okay, what do we mean by destruction? Well, think of America 200 years ago. Okay, there weren't these great cities that we have now. There weren't the towns all over the place. There weren't very large farms in a lot of areas. As colonization increased, there was more need to clear cut areas to provide farming land. As they remove that to provide food for the animals, that changes the ecosystem. Animals that normally would have lived in a forested area no longer have the forested area to live in, and so therefore we're removing their habitat. Urban development, growth of towns, growth of cities has removed a lot of that. Pollution, okay, we talked about the acid rain already, but other forms of industrial pollution have led to dramatically loss of habitat that normally would have been used by organisms living in that area. Disruption, okay, we're seeing a lot of this now, in particular with the second example here, the use of pesticides or insecticides, where we're not only killing the pests, but we're removing the pollinators too. And the loss of these pollinators will have a direct effect on the diversity and the repopulation of plants. So disruption of the species, disruption of the areas of the biodiversity in this case shows how the impact has at a different level. The last one is habitat fragmentation, okay? And so what habitat fragmentation is, and we're showing an example here, as you can see over time on this particular island, the green areas represent habitats that a particular animal or organism could have lived in. And you can see how it's lost over time till we have small areas that they can be maintained in. And so the loss of these larger areas has resulted in fragmentation, breaking up the larger community into these smaller areas. And that impact is pretty significant. And we can think of this from a genetic level, okay? The loss of crossbreeding, okay? If we have normal organisms, in this case, that could breed much larger areas that they had to interact with each other, the loss of that interaction leads to less sharing of genetic information. Less sharing of less genetic variation means more potential susceptibility to other issues that may come out. And so that's what we refer to as edge effects. So edge effects are where we separate things and they're around the edge or the outside of the area. They no longer are able to interact as much together. Okay. Introduction of non-native species. Invasive species have had a huge impact on ecosystems. Okay? Non-native species, these are species that normally are not found in a particular area. And quite often, because we're opening up a new ecosystem, let's say it this way, we're increasing the fundamental niche of these organisms because they've never been exposed to that before. So I give you a couple of examples here, and then I'll talk about a couple of current issues that we see. So the zebra mussels, this little guy here, okay? The zebra mussels were introduced to Lake Erie through large barges that were bringing the materials were being used to ship from overseas. As they emptied the bilge water, so that as they unloaded, it would sit higher in the water so that it wouldn't, or as they unloaded, it would go deeper, it wouldn't sit too high. These zebra mussel larvae were in there, and when they were introduced into the lake, they literally took over. And so this particular slide is showing a pipe that was removed from an area in the lake that was used to normally move water. And notice how it grows up inside there, and so they took over. And so they've been looking at ways recently to be able to take advantage of some natural predators, and that seems to be effective to be able to reduce the population size. Another example is the Nile perch. So the Nile perch was introduced into Lake Victoria, and this is Lake Victoria here, which is a large lake in Central Africa, headwaters of the Nile. That's going to be a natural system. In the 1950s, Nile perch were introduced that for agricultural, for production. They're a very good freshwater fish for meat. And so what happens is over time, when these were being maintained, they seemed to fit into the ecosystem. Well, in the 1980s, there was an algal bloom. Okay, and that means that there was release of chemicals or something in there that caused the algae to grow very dramatically. Well, the result of this is the cichlids that live in there, okay, increased in number. They had a lot of food source, and they were able to take advantage of that. As a result of that, the predator fish, the Nile perch, numbers also began to dramatically increase. As the algal bloom came under control, all of a sudden the Nile perch, which was now not native to that area, began to take over, and you've seen changes in the ecosystem as a result of that. So these invasive species potentially can take over an ecosystem. What are some examples we see now? Well, the snakehead fish, and if you're in Maryland or you've been around Maryland, this was introduced. It's a very aggressive fish, and so it has the potential to take over large areas. If you spend any time on the Mississippi, you'll know that the Asian carp are coming in and taking over large portions of the Mississippi River because, again, they're a non-native species. They're out competing the species that are there. Kudzu, okay? This literally is a light pole in the south, and that grew in 1 year. Okay. Kudzu was a Japanese plant, a legume that was introduced into the south as a potential very rapid growing food for cattle. Unfortunately, the cattle didn't like to eat it. But once it was introduced, it begins to grow all over the place, and it takes over species. So it has a large one. One of the newest one is this little guy here, the emerald ash borer. The emerald ash borer is as the name implies, is an insect that prefers to live in ash trees. And we have a number in this area, but the problem is they also have a tendency to kill the ash tree when they begin to get in there. And so the ash tree populations are beginning to reduce. And we see other examples with a similar mechanism to this that have been introduced. The point is that these invasive species come in, there's no natural competition for what they want, and they grow out of control. Okay? And that's going to be disruption, which can lead to extinction. So what is an example of an extinction cascade? Okay, well, this is sort of a natural, again, we're going to see the human impact on this, but we can see how this leads to other levels that can lead to extinction at that level. So in this example, we're talking about the extinction cascade as a result of whaling. So we're connecting together the different parts of this ecosystem to show how it's beginning to change the habitat. So whaling has a big source, and we remove these whales from the population. The large whales, blue whales, sperm whales, they're plankton eaters, okay? And so they'll eat large amounts of plankton. And so as the whaling was introduced and removed these particular this particular level of the ecosystem from there, this increased the population of other large or other fish that would take advantage of that. In this case, we're talking about pollock that was brought in there. And the pollock are able to, as their numbers increased, they're able to outproduce or outgain the perch and the herring that normally live there. And so there's a loss then of the perch and herring. Without the perch and herring in the population, all of a sudden there's no support for the seals and sea lions. Their food source is gone. This in turn results in loss of prey for killer whales. And so we see a reduction in the fitness, if not the loss of the population itself, of the orca, of the killer whales. And that means they're going to be looking for a new prey to use. In this case, they turn from the seals and sea lions to begin consuming the otters. Otters, which normally will eat sea urchins and other invertebrates that are found in the ocean, okay, are no longer eating them, which means the population of sea urchins begins to go out of control, which reduces the size of the kelp forests. Loss of the kelp forest means we're losing habitat where the fish would normally hide from predators. Okay. Loss of the fish habitat, loss of the fish means the predatory birds no longer have their food, and so the eagles and the other birds of prey begin to reduce their population size. So you can see how in this cascade, it's a very complex connection, and understanding this from a conservation point of view means looking at each level and considering how one level impacts the other. Okay? So what are some of the approaches that we can take to restoration? Okay, and so I'm going to talk about three here that will be some approaches for habitat restoration. So pristine restoration. Pristine restoration simply means a reintroduction of the native species. Okay, and so this is taking the species that historically were present there and reintroducing them in a manner that allows them to be able to excel and return the ecosystem to its natural setting. An important consideration in this is proportion. If you plant too much of one tree or don't provide enough of one animal, then you have an imbalance in the ecosystem, which will unfortunately not allow for reestablishment to occur. The second approach is, rather than introducing new species, is simply removing introduced species or invasive species. And this theoretically will allow you to reestablish the populations of the native species. Finally, we can look at just simply cleanup and rehabilitation. So areas, think about the mine drainage situation that we have here on campus. So Mining has occurred all through this part of western Pennsylvania, which has led to pollution in the streams. So our approach, or at least part of our approach here, has been to remove the iron and the other chemicals that are in there to allow then the polluted areas to begin to regrow and reestablish the natural populations. Okay. One consideration when looking at an individual species, and I give you three there, the peregrine falcon, California condor, and the Yellowstone wolf, is captive breeding and reintroduction. We talked a little earlier this semester about the red wolf in the southern parts of the United States. And so the reintroduction is good, but when we're caring for them and in the populations, we need to be aware of what the system is so that as we're rearing and breeding these animals, they're prepared to be reintroduced. Okay? We also have to consider genetic diversity in this case, okay? Because we need to make sure that we are providing the genetic variation so that we don't have founder's effects, so that there isn't some unforeseen change that can come up that will limit that in the future. And this graph is showing over the years the return of the peregrine falcon, which appears to have successful. It looks like we're in that exponential growth. We haven't reached the carrying capacity yet, so we're able to see and understand how that is going to be moved forward. So a couple of case studies. Okay, the first one is looking at Lake Victoria. And we just talked about this a few minutes ago. And that feller is holding a Nile perch, very large Nile perch, that he apparently caught. But when we consider this Lake Victoria, you'll notice what happens to the population over time. So in the 1960s, population density around there was fairly low. As we increased population over time, okay, we see, as I mentioned, there was an algal bloom which affected the population diversity in there, and that the Nile perch kind of has been taking over. And so when we talk about this particular case, there's a need to have further improve treatment of water that's being removed into Lake Victoria to avoid this potential to remove the Nile perch or find means to reduce the Nile perch so that the natural populations have an opportunity to come in. Okay. Another example is the prairie chicken. Okay. And this is an example. You can see the prairie chicken here. And so if you look at the diversity of locations, you can see the past distribution shown by the light blue color here. Okay. It covered most of the Midwest up into Canada. So it was a very successful bird. It had a nice role in the niche that was involved there. Over time, limiting of the ecosystem changes, like we mentioned with fragmentation or urban development, has led to a dramatic reduction in the areas that is now present. So over time, we've been working to be able to improve grasslands, return to a more stable situation, so that as we reintroduce the prairie chicken to areas that it used to live in, the ecosystem is more representative to what it used to be there, so that the prairie chicken will be able to excel. Okay. Thank you again for watching this video. If you have questions, as always, please post them on the discussion board on Schoology and/or contact me. Thank you.